Greetings. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And in this last mini lecture for this first chapter, I want to get away from talking about what power is to why is it desired. I've already talked about that power is seen as the currency of political science, that it's a means to pursue people's self-interests. And okay, that's good as far as it goes. But what is it that drives people for this pursuit for power? How and why, for example, are people able to exert power over others? How are they able to, for example, exert authority, which remember in the last mini lecture I said is the psychological ability of leaders to get others to obey them? There are a lot of explanations. I'm not going to go through them in much detail. There are whole courses debate that are devoted to political behavior. But I do want to hint at four of them because I'll talk about them in a little bit of detail later on. Aristotle, who we're going to talk about in chapter 2, one of the ancient Greek political theorists, and in my mind, the first political scientist, said that he believed that it is innate human behavior, that by our very nature we are political animals, that we are social creatures. Karl Marx used the term that people are a species being. So Marx agreed with Aristotle that it's part of who we are, that we live naturally in herds like elephants or deer, for example. We're kind of pack animals, right? Think about that. The worst punishment that can be given to people is to put them in solitary confinement, right? So the notion that we're social creatures, we're political animals, and essentially Aristotle's belief was that obeying leaders is innate human behavior. That just as there is a natural leader, for example, in an elephant herd or in a deer pack, or think about wolves, for example, that there is a lead dog in that particular case, that it's the same thing with human beings. And if you think about it, notice children on a playground. The children to an adult all appear to be about the same size, and yet, almost naturally, a few people kind of become seen as the leaders, and many others become followers. And it's hard to even explain how or why that one child has taken on this leadership role and why others are so willing to follow. And Aristotle's response is well, that's innate human behavior, that a few people become leaders and most people become followers. It does, though, beg a very important question that I put down. If I could question Aristotle about this, my question would be, well, if all of this is true, and certainly it appears that there is some truth to this, but then the question is, well, why do people disobey authority? If this is innate, if this is something natural, if obeying leaders is built in us, if this is the way we're wired, then why do many people disobey authority and disobey the law and all of those things? And that's a question that goes way beyond this mini lecture, but it's certainly an interesting thought that we will come back to. A second explanation for power is psychological. I stole this from a man called Irving Janis, if you're wondering who Janis was. Janis wrote a very, very good book many years ago called Victims of Groupthink. And essentially, what Irving Janis said in this book is that people are natural conformists, that people have a need to fit into groups and norms. And so, for example, Irving Janis, and I think the best chapter in the book, talks about Lyndon Johnson, talks about how he had a group called the Tuesday Lunch Group. And shortly after Johnson became president, there was a debate within the group about the Vietnam War. A majority of the group favored the war, as did Lyndon Johnson, but there were a couple of nonconformists. There were a couple people who didn't fit well in the group. They were led by two men, one that maybe you've heard of if you've watched a lot of PBS. The other one, unless you've had a good history course, you may not be familiar, but their names were Bill Moyers, who used to have specials on a regular basis on PBS, and the other man was George Ball. And it's really interesting what started happening. The other people in the group began making fun of Moyers and Ball. They would show up and people would say things like, "Oh, here comes Mr. Peace, Mr. Love, Mr. Dove, Mr. Don't Drop the Bomb." And they just absolutely ridiculed these two people because they didn't fit into the rest of the group who were all in favor of the war. And to make a very long story short, both Moyers and Ball ended up resigning from the Johnson administration. And Janice said this had horrible consequences because what it meant was that all of the advisors close to Johnson were merely telling him what he wanted to hear, that the war was winnable, that we were on the right side of this, that domino theory was there, that if Vietnam fell to the communists, it would spread throughout Laos and Thailand and Cambodia and et cetera and et cetera. Okay? So there's a biological explanation, a psychological explanation. A third explanation is cultural. And these people disagree a lot with both the people who say it's part of our biology and psychology. Instead, these people claim that human behavior is learned activity. It's not innate, it's not inherited. And if there's a positive about this, what this means is that bad behavior can be unlearned and society can be improved over time. And so their argument is that power is a concept that is artificial and that is taught to us culturally through things like socialization, political patriotism, right? A belief in institutional norms and rules, and political culture types. Once again, if any of you took me for Political Science 1201, you may remember that I used Elazar's famous study, which said that there were multiple political culture types in the United States, and political cultures merely distinctive ways of looking at politics. So the primary motivation in most Western states is that politics is a means to improve the community. The primary political goal in northern states is that politics is primarily a means to get things for yourself and for your followers. In southern states, the primary political objective or goal in the traditionalistic culture of the South is to maintain the status quo and to try to hold off changes if at all possible. So, depending on the culture in which you're raised in, politics and power have very different meaning. In Western states, for example, people have a lot more power. In California, for example, we have the power of the initiative, the referendum, and recall. In the state of California, we recalled our most powerful individual. Many years ago, we recalled our governor. We became only the second state in the history of the United States to remove a governor from office before their time expired. And so in most Western states, the people are given direct political power. Through the initiative, we can pass a law or constitutional amendment without the state legislature passing it, for example. With a recall, we can actually remove a public official before their term expires. You're not going to see those kinds of things in southern states. Different cultures and therefore different distributions of power. The last one that I have mentioned is one that I've already mentioned, rational choice. The assumption of rational choice scholars are that people know what they want most of the time, They have good reasons for their preferences. And obviously, people like Hobbes and Locke and Jefferson and Madison all make that claim that people give government its power because we're better off with a government that has a lot of power than under a state of anarchy where people's liberties and freedoms would not be protected. It would be chaos. It would potentially be a state of war or, at worst, unfulfilled. So people give power to government out of a rational choice. They believe we're better off with it than without it. In the 4 minutes that I have left in the mini lecture, I just want to go over a few terms. You should know what a theory is. So when I mentioned the term theory throughout the semester, and your textbook goes into a lot more detail on these concepts than me, right? A theory is an idea that's been tested that aims to demonstrate a correlation between phenomena, right? So, for example, one of the hypotheses that has existed in the United States for a long time, right? A hypothesis is an educated guess about an experiment. For the last 40 years, there has been a hypothesis in America that women are more liberal than men, women are more likely to vote for the Democrats, Republicans are more likely to vote for the Republicans, and so there is a correlation, right, between phenomenon, which in this case would be gender, and voting. And in the United States, that tends to be true. But what's interesting is that when we look at most European societies, the opposite is true. For example, if we look at the country of France, in France, women tend to vote more conservative and men more liberal. So then you have to understand, well, maybe there's more to this than just gender, because in one society, women vote more liberally, and in the other society, women vote more conservatively. So we would have to get into why that is. When we talk about data, and here I probably should have put that, when we're talking about, well, what builds up political knowledge? So you may want to write that in the margin, types of political knowledge. Descriptive or description are merely political facts. This is explaining what is, and that's no longer true, right? In your notes, at when I first wrote these notes to myself, John Boehner was the Speaker of the House. Of course, today the Speaker of the House is actually Nancy Pelosi. So that would be a fact. There's no need to theorize about it. There's no need to do an experiment. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. Aristotle made the claim many centuries ago that democracy would work best with a large middle class. Well, modern day political scientists say, you know what? He had an interesting theory. There is a connection between economics and politics, and we now believe that democracy, with rare exception, is only stable in countries with a gross domestic product of more than $8,000 a year. So when we talk about description, we're talking about what is. Now, the ancient Greeks, which is where we're going to turn in the next chapter, they're normative theorists. They're not interested in what is. They're explaining what ought to be. They want to make the political system better over time. So a religious study of politics, or the Greek emphasis on social justice, would certainly fit here. And when we talk about one of the big debates in politics, and I want to conclude with this, is this debate between realism and idealism. So the normative theorists are idealists. They're talking about what ought to be. The political realists say that we need to work with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. So I mentioned earlier Machiavelli focused on power to unify Italy and expel foreigners who ruined it. That the prince has to be rational, has to be tough in exercising power because he has a noble goal, the protection of his people and the prestige and power of his society. We turn next to the ancient Greeks.